Hi, welcome to the complete ASP NET.
So what is this MVC all about? Well, MVC stands for Model View Controller, and it's one of architectural patterns for implementing user interfaces. Although it was originally developed for desktop applications back in the 1970s, it's been widely adopted as an architecture for web applications. And as a result, many frameworks have been created that enforce this pattern. ASP NET MVC is one of them. There are many other similar MVC frameworks like Ruby on Rails or Express for Node. In an MVC application, model represents the application data and behavior in terms of its problem domain and independent of the user interface. For example, in our video rental application, our model will consist of classes like movie, customer, rental, transaction, and so on. These classes have properties and methods that purely represent the application state and rules. They are not tied to the user interface, which means you can take these classes and use them in a different kind of app like a desktop or a mobile app. They are plain old CLR objects or POCOs. V in MVC represents the view and is the HTML markup that we display to the user. And C is a controller, which is responsible for handling an HTTP request. For example, imagine our application is hosted at vidly.com. When we send a request to vidly.com/movies, a controller will be selected to handle this request. This controller will get all the movies from the database, put them in a view, and return the view to the client or the browser. So with this architecture, you see each component has a distinct responsibility, and this results in better separation of concerns and a more maintainable application. Now, there is one more piece to this architecture, which is not in the acronym MVC, but is nearly always there. It's a router. Earlier, I told you that when a request comes in the application, a controller will be selected for handling that request. Selecting the right controller is the responsibility of a router. A router, based on some rules, knows that the request with the URL/movies should be handled by a class called movies controller. More accurately, it should be handled by one of the methods of this class, because a class can have many different methods. In ASP NET MVC, we refer to methods of a controller as actions. So it's more accurate to say that an action in a controller is responsible for handling a request. So this was ASP NET MVC in 3 minutes. Okay, to follow along with this course, first of all, you need Visual Studio 2013 or higher. In this course, I'm using Visual Studio 2013 Community Edition, which is free. Also, I'm going to use a few plugins to increase my productivity and make my development experience more enjoyable. So open up Visual Studio, under Tools, go to Extensions and Updates. On the left side, select Online, and here, search for Visual Studio Productivity Power Tools. So you can see I have installed Productivity Power Tools 2013. This is an extension that brings in a lot of useful features to increase your productivity. Next, search for Web Essentials. Again, you can see I've installed this plugin. In your case, you'll see a button to install this plugin. And the last plugin, which is optional, is ReSharper. So you don't necessarily need ReSharper to follow along with this course, but I highly recommend you to download and install it because I'm going to show you lots of time-saving tips and tricks. ReSharper is a commercial plugin and the price is somewhere about $70 to $90 a year. And I highly recommend you to invest this money and add ReSharper to your toolbox because the number of hours you will save per year will save you far more than $90 a year. And by the way, I'm not a ReSharper affiliate. I don't get a penny from promoting this. I'm just recommending ReSharper because I only teach you the best tools because I want you to be outstanding in your career. Now, whether you want to get a ReSharper license or not is your decision, but you can get a free 30-day trial version of ReSharper to try the time-saving tricks I'm going to show you in the course. And if you don't want to get ReSharper, that's perfectly fine. Don't panic. I will show you how to get things done without ReSharper as well. All right, our development environment is ready. Next, we're going to create our first MVC application. So in Visual Studio, go to the File menu, New, Project. On the left side, under Templates, expand Visual C# and Web. And here select ASP.NET Web Application. I'm going to call this Vidly and store it in my C drive in the projects folder. Now here you see Add to Source Control is selected because I'm going to add this to Git. If you don't have Git on your machine or you don't want to add this under source control, don't worry about this. So untick the checkbox. Okay. Now here in the list of templates, select MVC. And make sure host in the cloud is not selected because we are not going to deploy this in the cloud yet. Select OK. Now, because I selected Add to Source Control, I see this dialog box where I can select either Team Foundation Version Control or TFS or Git. I'm going to select Git. OK. OK, beautiful. Our project is created. Let's see what we've got inside this project. So, open up Solution Explorer. Here we've got a bunch of folders like app_data, which is where our database file will be stored. We have app_start, which includes a few classes that are called when the application is started. Let's take a look at one of these, for example. Route config. So this is the configuration of our routing rules. Here you see we have a route with the name default and with this URL pattern. So if a URL matches this pattern, the first part of the URL is assumed to be the name of the controller. The second part is assumed to be the name of the action. And the third part is an ID we can pass to that action. With this rule, if we send a request to /movies/popular, ASP.NET Runtime will call a method or an action called popular in movies controller. Or as another example, if we send a request to /movies/edit/1, ASP.NET Runtime will call the edit action of the movies controller and will pass 1 as the ID to this action. So back here, you can see we have some default values in this route. So if our URL doesn't have any of these parts, it will be passed to the home controller. Similarly, if the URL has only the controller but not the action, it will be handled by the index action. So if we go to /movies, since the action name is not specified in the URL, it will be indexed in movies controller. Also, you can see that ID is an optional parameter. Because not every action needs an ID. We only need this when we're working with a specific resource like a movie or a customer with a given ID. We also have this content folder where we store our CSS files, images, and any other client-side assets. Next, we have controllers. And you can see our default project template has 3 controllers. Account, which has actions for sign up, log in, log out. Home, which represents the homepage. And manage, which provides a number of actions for handling requests around user's profile, like changing password, enabling 2-factor authentication, using social logins, and so on. We have fonts, which shouldn't really be here in the root. I would personally prefer to move this under content folder, but we'll leave that for a later lecture. We have models, so all our domain classes will be here. Next, we have scripts, where we store our JavaScript files. And finally, we have views, so V in MVC. Now look, here we have folders named after controllers in our application. Let me expand controllers again. So we have account, home, and manage controller. And interestingly, we have 3 folders with the same names excluding controller. So by convention, when we use a view in a controller, ASP.NET will look for that view in a folder with the same name as the controller. We also have a folder called shared, which includes the views that can be used across different controllers. And finally, we've got a few other files here. Fave icon is the icon of the application displayed in the browser. Global ASAX is one of the traditional files that has been in ASP.NET for a long time. And it's a class that provides hooks for various events in the application's lifecycle. So let's expand this and open the C# file. So when the application is started, this method will be called. And here you can see we are registering a few things, like the routes. So when the application is started, we tell the runtime, these are the routes for our application. Next, we have packages.config, which is used by NuGet Package Manager. If you have never worked with NuGet, it's a package manager similar to NPM or Node Package Manager or Bower. If you have never worked with any package managers before, we use them to manage the dependencies of our application. So let's say our application has dependency to 5 external libraries. Instead of going to 5 different websites for downloading these libraries, we use a package manager, and this package manager will download these dependencies from its central repository. Also, if in the future one of these libraries has a newer version, again, we use our package manager to upgrade one or more of the existing packages. We don't have to go to 5 different websites. We also have this startup.cs, which is a new approach Microsoft is taking for starting the application. So in the next version of ASP.NET called ASP.NET Core 1.0, which is not ready yet, they've dropped global.asax, and all the startup logic is implemented in this startup class. And finally, we have web.config, which is an XML that includes the configuration for our application. Out of all the elements you see in this XML, mostly you'll need to work with only 2 sections. Connection strings, which is where we specify database connection strings, and app settings, which is where we define configuration settings for our application. Okay, now that you have a good understanding of what is inside this project, let's see the building blocks of MVC architecture in action. Okay, in Solution Explorer, right-click Models, and add a new class here. I'm going to call this Movie. We give it a couple of properties, like integer ID and string name. To quickly create a property, just type prop, press tab. This is a code snippet. You specify the type, then press tab again, and the name of the property. So this class is a plain old CLR object, or POCO, which represents the state and behavior of our application in terms of its problem domain. In this case, it doesn't have any behavior or logic. It just has a couple of properties, which we use for representing state. Now, let's say we want to create a page where we randomly pick a movie and render its details. Assuming that this page would be under /movies/random, we need to create a controller called movies controller with an action called random. So, in Solution Explorer, right-click Controllers, add Controller. Here we have different templates, and most of them are used for auto-generating some code, which we call scaffolding. But we are not going to use any of these templates because I want you to learn how to create a controller from scratch. So select the first one, add, call this Movies Controller. So this controller is a very simple class that derives from the controller class. And here we have an action called index, which returns action result. I'm going to change the name of this action to random. So this will be called when we go to /movies/random. Now in this method, I'm going to create an instance of our movie model. So movie, new movie. Now, because I'm using ReSharper automatically resolves the namespace for this class. If you're not using ReSharper, you need to go on top of this file and manually type using vidly.models. Back here, let's set the name of the movie, Shrek. In a real-world application, we often get a model from a database. But for now, to keep things simple, let's just focus on the core building blocks of MVC apps. Now here you can see that this method is returning a view. And the reason this view is red is because ReSharper is telling me that this view file does not exist in the application. So in the Solution Explorer, under Views, look, inside Movies folder, we don't have a view called random. So right click, add, view, call this random. Here we have template, which we can use to auto-generate a view, but we're not going to use this feature. Under options, we can tick this box to create this view as a partial view. A partial view is not a complete page. It's like a widget that we can reuse on different views. We are not interested in that, so untick. Here we have a checkbox for selecting the layout for this view. A layout is like a template or a master page. We want all the views in our application to have the same look and feel. So let's select the layout. By default, our MVC project has a layout under Views, Shared, called Underline Layout. So select this and add the view. Okay, here you see a mixture of HTML and C# code prefixed with an @ sign. So on the top, we have a block, and inside this block, we are setting two properties. One is viewback.title, which we'll look at later, but basically this is going to be the title of our page shown in the browser. And next, we're setting the layout for this view. After this code block, we have just plain HTML. Now I want to go back to the controller, press Ctrl and Tab. This way we can switch between open tabs. Look, view is no longer red, because now we have a view on the disk. Now I want to put this model, movie model, in our view so we can render it. Again, Ctrl Tab to go back to the view. I want to change this heading and render the name of our movie. So we need to write C# code. We start with @ and then type model. Every view has this property which gives us access to the model we pass to it in the controller. Now in the IntelliSense, note that the type of this model is dynamic. It's not a movie. So if I use the dot operator, I cannot see the name property of this movie here. So on top of the file, we need to use a directive to specify the type of the model for this view. So @ model, and this has to be lowercase. And here we specify the fully qualified name of our model class. So the name of the application, vidly.models.movie. Now, if you're using ReSharper, you don't have to remember this fully qualified name. You can just type movie and press enter. ReSharper automatically resolves the namespace. Okay, back here, now we can type model dot, and look, we've got ID and name properties here. So let's render the name. All right, now let's run the application. Because we are in the random view, and this view is inside the movies folder, if we press Ctrl and F5 now, our browser will take us to /movies/random. So Ctrl F5. Okay, congratulations. So you have seen a model, a view, and a controller in action. Throughout the rest of the course, we'll work on more sophisticated scenarios, but the fundamentals will be very similar to what you have seen in this video. Okay, now let's go to the home page. I don't like this default template that comes with our application. It looks a little bit ugly. So let's find a better template. Our ASP NET MVC application uses Bootstrap as its front-end CSS framework. So to replace this template, we need to find a Bootstrap template. Head over to bootswatch.com. Here you see a bunch of different templates for Bootstrap. Under Themes, select Lumen. So scroll down. Our navigation bar will look like this. Here we can see the buttons, tables, forms. So nice and clean. Now under Lumen, select bootstrap.css. This is the Bootstrap CSS file, but with modified styles. You need to save this file on the disk, and I would suggest to call it bootstrap-lumen to distinguish from the original Bootstrap file. Then add it in the project under the content folder. So here you see I have both Bootstrap and bootstrap-lumen. Now we need to replace the reference to Bootstrap with bootstrap-lumen. So Under app_start, open up bundle config. This is where we define various bundles of client-side assets. For example, we can combine and compress multiple JavaScript or CSS files into a bundle. And this way, we reduce the number of HTTP requests required to get these assets when a page is loaded. And this results in a faster page load. So here you see we have a few bundles, one for jQuery, and inside this bundle, we have the jQuery script. We have another bundle for jQuery validation plugin, and inside this bundle, we have all the files that match this pattern. We have another bundle for Modernizer, one for Bootstrap, and another one for our CSS assets. Inside our CSS bundle, we have Bootstrap and site.css, which includes a few generic styles for our application. Now add -lumen here. Now, because we have modified our C# code, we need to compile it in order to see the changes. So press Ctrl and F5 to compile and run the application again. All right, here's our new homepage with a new look and feel. Now get ready for a quick quiz. I want to test your knowledge about what you have learned in this section. So this was just a quick introduction to ASP.NET MVC. Now let me quickly give you a heads up about what is coming up over the next few sections. In the next section, we're going to look at the fundamentals of ASP.NET MVC in detail. By the end of this section, you will have a good and in-depth understanding of how ASP.NET MVC works. Next, we'll use Entity Framework to connect our application to a database. We'll be using Code First workflow for this, so if you're new to Code First, this is a great eye-opener. Then we'll add forms and implement validation. So at this point, you will know how to implement CRUD operations in ASP.NET MVC. Next, we'll look at using ASP.NET Web API to build RESTful services. So I will explain what RESTful convention means and how you can create RESTful services using ASP.NET Web API. Once we build our APIs, we'll shift our focus to client-side development. So we'll use jQuery to consume some of these APIs. In this section, you're going to learn about two very useful jQuery plugins. Next, we'll implement authentication and authorization using ASP.NET Identity Framework. So you will understand exactly how ASP.NET Identity works and how you can customize it for your applications. Next, I will talk about performance optimization. I will introduce you to 3-tier architecture, and for each tier, I will show you how you can optimize the performance of your application in that tier. Then in section 10, we'll put everything together and I will show you a systematic way to build a feature end-to-end. And finally, in the last section, you will learn about building and deployment. So there is a lot to cover, and I will see you in the next section. Well, hello, it's Mosh here, your instructor. I just wanted to let you know that what you have been watching so far is actually picked from my complete ASP.NET MVC 5 course on Udemy. In case you're interested to have the complete course, you can get it with a discount using the link in the video description. And if not, that's perfectly fine. Continue watching as the next section is coming up. Have a great day.
In this section, we're going to take a closer look at building blocks of ASP.NET MVC. And by the end of this section, you will have a much deeper understanding of how this framework works. More specifically, we're going to look at controllers, actions, routing, views, and view models. So let's get started.
So in the last section, you noticed that our random action returns action result. This action result is the base class for all action results in ASP.NET MVC. So depending on what an action does, it will return an instance of one of the classes that derive from action result. In our random action, we're calling this view method here, which is just a helper method inherited from the base controller class. This method allows us to quickly create a view result. Alternatively, we can return a view result like this. Return new view result. You can see that it's easier to just call the view method, and this approach is way more common amongst ASP.NET MVC developers. Now you might be asking, why is the return type of this method action result, even though we're actually returning a view result? Well, in case of this action, we could simply set the return type to view result. And this is actually good practice, especially when it comes to unit testing this action. This way, we'll save ourselves from an extra cast in our unit tests. We'll look at unit testing in the second part of this course. But sometimes it's possible that in an action, we may have different execution paths and return different action results. In that case, we need to set the return type of that action to action result so we can return any of its subtypes. Okay, view result is one of the action results that you work with most of the time. Let's take a look at other types of action results. We have partial view result to return a partial view, content result to return simple text, redirect result to redirect the user to a URL, redirect to route result to redirect to an action instead of a URL, JSON result to return a serialized JSON object, file result to return a file, HTTP not found result to return a not found or 404 error, an empty result which is used when an action doesn't need to return any values, like void. As you can see, for all these types, except empty result, we have a helper method in the base controller class. So let's see some of these in action. Back in the code, I'm going to comment this out. Let's return content, like hello world. Let's run the application with Control and F5 and navigate to /movies/random. So look, we just get plain string content in the response. Another example, let's return HTTP not found. Now build the application with Control-Shift-B. This will compile the application without opening a new tab in the browser. Now press Alt and Tab to switch back to Chrome and Control-R to refresh the page. Okay, look, we got the standard 404 error. Now for empty result, we don't have a helper method. So if you want to create an action that doesn't return anything, you need to return an instance of empty result like this. Return new empty result. Control-Shift-B to build. Alt and Tab. Control-R. Okay, look, there's nothing in the response. And the last example. Return redirect to action. Here we specify the name of the action and then the controller. Now sometimes, as we are redirecting the user from one page to another, we need to pass arguments to the target action. To pass arguments, we use an anonymous object as the third argument to this method. So, new anonymous object, let's say page is 1 and sort by is name. Build, back to Chrome, refresh. Okay, look, we got redirected to the home page. And you can see in the browser address bar that the arguments we sent are appearing as part of the query string. So this is pretty much all you need to know about action results. By the way, don't think you need to memorize any of this stuff. For the most part, you'll be using view, HTTP not found, and redirect result. In the last lecture, we looked at action results, which are the output of our actions. Now, let's take a look at action parameters, which are the inputs to our actions. When a request comes in the application, ASP.NET MVC automatically maps request data to parameter values for action methods. So, if an action method takes a parameter, the MVC framework looks for a parameter with the same name in the request data. If a parameter with that name exists, the framework will automatically pass the value of that parameter to the target action. This parameter value can be embedded in the URL, it can be in the query string, or in the data posted using a form. So, back in the movies controller, I'm going to create a new action. Public action result, edit with a parameter called ID. And here I just want to return simple content. ID equals plus ID. Let's run the application. First we compile with Ctrl+Shift+B, Alt and Tab, back to the browser. I'm going to change the URL to movies/edit/1. This is an example of a parameter embedded in the URL. You can see that it gets automatically mapped by the MVC framework. I can also pass this parameter in the query string. So Ctrl+L, I'm going to change this to ID equals 1. It gets mapped again. But let's see what happens if I rename this parameter to movie ID. To rename, we press F2. So all references are renamed automatically. Movie ID. One more time, build, back to the browser, refresh. We got an exception. The parameters dictionary contains a null entry for parameter movie ID. So ASP NET MVC couldn't find a parameter called movie ID embedded in the URL or in the query string or in the request body passed by form. And that's why we get this exception. Now I can change the query string parameter to movie ID. The error is gone. But in this case, I cannot embed one in the URL because the name of the parameter in our default route is ID. It's not movie ID. Let's have a look at our default route one more time. So in Solution Explorer, open up route config. Look, here's our default route. And the parameter we have here is called ID. So the value that we pass here will be identified as ID, not movie ID. And in Movies controller, this movie ID will not be initialized when this action is called. Now let's rename this back to ID. So this is how ASP NET MVC maps request data to parameters of our actions. We can also use optional parameters in our actions. So let's create a new action. Public action result index. So this action will be called when we navigate to movies. Now in this action, imagine we'll return a view with the list of movies in the database. We can add two optional parameters here, page index and string sort by. So if page index is not specified, we display the movies in page 1. And similarly, if sort by is not specified, we sort the movies by their name. Now to make a parameter optional, we should make it nullable. So for page index, I'm going to add a question mark here to make it a nullable integer. And for sort by, we don't have to do anything because the string type in C# is a reference type and it's nullable. Now inside the action, we check to see if these parameters have a value. So if page index has value, I put the not operator here. So if it doesn't have a value, I initialize it to 1. Similarly, if string is null or white space, we pass sort by here. Then we initialize it to name. And finally, for the purpose of our demo, I'm just going to return simple content. So string.format, page index equals the first parameter, and sort by equals the second parameter. And I pass page index and sort by here. Okay, now build, Ctrl+Shift+B, back to the browser. Let's go to movies. So you can see I didn't have to specify any parameters, and by default page index is 1 and sort by is name. I can override this parameter, so I can pass page index, set it to 2, and you can see it's updated here. But sort by is still name. I can override that too. Sort by release date. Now it's updated. Now in this case, we cannot embed these parameters in the URL because that would require a custom route that includes 2 parameters. In the next lecture, I will show you how to create a custom route. So this default route in our application works for most scenarios, but there are situations where we need a route with multiple parameters. For example, in our video rental app, we may want to have a route like this, where we can get the movies by the release year and month. So let me show you how to create a custom route. In route config class, before our default route, we call route.map_route. The reason you need to add this route before the default route is because the order of these routes matters. You need to define them from the most specific to most generic. Otherwise, a more generic route will be applied to a URL, and that's not what you want. This method has a few overloads. The one we use most of the time is the one that takes 3 parameters: name, URL, and default. So let's give our new route a name. And this name should be unique. So movies by release date. Now let's put this on a new line to keep the code consistent and clean. Next parameter is the URL pattern. So movies/released. Here we need 2 parameters, year and month. And note that I've enclosed these parameters in curly braces. Now, the third argument. We need to specify the defaults. We use an anonymous object for that. So, new anonymous object. Here we set the name of the controller to movies and the action to by release date. That's it. That's how we define a custom route. Now let's create this action. So save, back to movies controller. I'll show you a quick way to create an action. Type MVC action 4 and press tab. So this is another code snippet. So we call this by release date. This action takes 2 parameters, year and month. For the month, we could use a byte because the largest number we want here is 12, but it doesn't really matter. Now here, again, I want to return simple content. So year plus slash plus month. Now build, back to the browser. Let's navigate to movies/released. I'm not specifying any parameters. We got a 404 error because our URL has not matched any of our route patterns. Now let's put the year and the month. So our route parameters are here. We can also add constraints to our route. For example, let's say we want to enforce that the year and month parameters to be 4 and 2 digits respectively. So back in our route definition, we supply another argument to map_route method. Again, we use an anonymous object. And here we can use regular expressions to apply constraints. So I want the year to be 4-digit number. So set it to a verbatim string, \d, which represents a digit. And the number in curly braces represents the number of repetitions. The reason I put an @ sign here is because \/ is an escape character. And if we don't use @ sign here, we'll have to add another \, and this looks a little bit ugly. So undo, that's better. Now similarly, I'm going to set month to a regular expression, \d with 2 digits. Build, back to the browser. Now if I refresh, we got a 404 error, and that's because of our constraint. But if we add a 0 here, everything works. Now let me show you another example. Let's say we want to constrain the year to 2015 and 2016. Now this doesn't quite make sense in the context of listing movies by year, but sometimes you may want to limit the route parameters to a few specific values. Again, we can use a regular expression to apply that constraint. So I'm going to change this to 2015 or 2016. So this is how we define custom routes in ASP.NET MVC. In the next lecture, I will show you a cleaner way to create a custom route. Okay, look at this code. Currently, we have only one custom route here. But if you're working on a large application, sooner or later, this file is going to grow with a lot of custom routes, and over time, it becomes a mess. Plus, another issue with this approach is that you have to go back and forth between your actions and custom routes. And the third issue is that if we go back to Movies controller and rename this action to by release here, you can see it's not updated here. And that's because of this magic string. So when we rename a controller or an action, we have to remember to come back here and apply that name change as well. So this code is fragile because of this magic string. In ASP.NET MVC 5, Microsoft introduced a cleaner and better way to create a custom route. Instead of creating the route here, we can apply it using an attribute to the corresponding action. So you might ask, Mosh, why did you teach me the old and poor way of creating custom routes? Because you may be working with an existing code base with convention-based custom routes. So you need to understand how they work. But if you're building a new application or improving an existing one, I would recommend you to use attribute routing. Now let me show you how to define this custom route using an attribute. First, in order to use attribute routing, you need to enable it. So routes.map MVC attribute routes. We call this method. Now let's delete this route. Save. Back to the controller. We apply the route attribute. And here we pass the URL template. So movies/released/year/month. Now, to apply a constraint, we add colon. And then we add regex to apply a regular expression. This is like a function that we call. In parentheses, we pass the actual regular expression. So digit repeated 4 times. Note that this regular expression is not a string. So unlike verbatim strings, we have to repeat this backslash twice. Now with attribute routes, we can also apply other kinds of constraints. For example, I can apply a second constraint to this month parameter. So after regex, colon again, this time I'm going to use range to set a range between 1 and 12. So you see attribute routes are more powerful. We also have a bunch of other constraints like min, max, min length and max length for strings, integer, float, GUID, and so on. You don't have to memorize any of these constraints. Just be aware that they're supported by the framework. If you need to apply constraints to your attribute routes, just Google ASP.NET MVC attribute route constraints. Okay, so far, we have looked at controllers and routing in detail. Now we're going to slowly transition to views. So in the next lecture, I will show you a few different ways to pass data to views. Earlier in the introduction section, we created this action to display a movie. In this action, we passed our model to the view by passing it as an argument to the view method. There are 2 other ways to pass data to views, and that's what I'm going to show you in this lecture. One way is to use the view data dictionary. So every controller has a property called view data, which is of type view data dictionary. So in this example, we can pass our movie to the view like this. Then we remove it from here. Now let's go to the view. With ReSharper, we can quickly navigate to the view for this action by putting the cursor on the view method and pressing Ctrl-B. In this dropdown, you see the name of the view, random.cshtml. If you're not using ReSharper, you need to go to Solution Explorer and find the view under Views, Movies, right here. Okay, now instead of using model property, we need to use view data. Now look, we can't access the name property of our movie because each item in the dictionary is of type object. So we need to explicitly cast it to the movie. Now don't type anything, just watch for a second because this code is going to get a little bit ugly. That's what I meant. So all these noisy parentheses, compare this to what we had before. Model.name. Which one do you think is better? It's obvious. Another problem with this approach is this magic string here. So back in the controller, if we change this movie to random movie, we have to remember to go back in the view and make this change here as well. Otherwise, we'll get a null reference exception. So this way of passing data to the views is fragile. We had this in the very first version of MVC, and then Microsoft decided to improve this, but in a very poor way. So they introduced viewBag, which is a dynamic type. So back in the controller, instead of using view data with a magic string, we use viewBag with a magic property. So this movie property is added to the viewBag at runtime, which means we don't get compile time safety. If we decide to change this magic property to random movie, again, we have to remember to go back in the view and change it here. Plus, we'll have the casting issue as well. So honestly, I have no idea what Microsoft was thinking when they introduced this viewBag as an improvement for view data. So please do not use view data or viewBag. If you want to pass data to a view, just use the approach I showed you earlier. So back in the controller, we get rid of these and just pass the movie object here. Now, you might be curious, where does this movie object go in the view result? Let me show you. So I create an instance of view result. View result.viewData.model. So this movie object we pass here will be assigned to this property. This view method here would take care of that, so we don't have to write all this extra code. What I want you to note here is that this view data, it's not a regular dictionary. It's a view data dictionary. So you can either use it as a dictionary with key value pairs or use its model property to work with an object. And that's the preferred way. Next, we're going to look at view models. In our random view, currently we just displayed the name of a movie. But what if we also wanted to display the list of customers who have rented this movie? In our domain model, there may not be a relationship between the movie and customer classes. So we need to pass two different models to this view. One is the movie, the other is the list of customers. But here we have only one model property. So how do we solve this problem? We use a view model. A view model is a model specifically built for a view. It includes any data and rules specific to that view. So let's see a view model in action. First, I'm going to add a customer class to the models folder. Add class, customer. Let's give it a couple of properties. ID and name. Now, we use this models folder purely for our domain classes, like movie, customer, and so on. We put view models in a separate folder. So let's create a new folder, add new folder, view models, and then we add a new class here, random movie view model. So as a convention, we use the view model suffix. This class needs two properties. One is the movie. Note that as I type the movie here, ReSharper automatically added this namespace here. The other property is a list of customers. Now, let's go back to our controller. In the random action, I'm going to quickly create a list of customers. We use the object initialization syntax to add two customer objects here. Customer 1 and 2. Now we create a view model object. Random movie view model. Again, ReSharper automatically resolved the namespace. Now let's initialize the movie property and the customers. Okay, so this is our view model. Now instead of sending the movie here, we send the view model. Now look, we have a red underline here. Argument type random movie view model is not assignable to model type movie. So basically, that means in the random view, because the type of the model for this view is the movie, we cannot give it a view model. So we need to change this to random movie view model. Now we have an error here because our view model doesn't have the name property. So we change it to model.movie.name. And you can see here we have access to model.customers. In the next lecture, I will show you how to render the list of customers. Okay, in this lecture, we're going to examine the razor view syntax in ASP.NET MVC. So you have learned that here, we can write C# code by prefixing it with an @ sign. To render the list of customers, we can simply use a for each block. So @ sign for each var customer in model.customers. We use a code block here. This is compulsory in ASP.NET MVC views, even if what you're going to put inside the for each block is only one line. Now here, inside this block, we can either continue writing C# code, like using an if statement, or we can write HTML. So the view engine in MVC called Razor View Engine knows how to parse this syntax. Let's say we want to display these customers using list items. So outside this for each block, I use the UL tag. Let's close it here. And inside the for each block, we use li. And here we switch back to C#. So @ sign customer.name. We can also use an if block to conditionally render content. For example, if no one has rented this movie before, we want to display a custom message. So if model.customers.count is 0, code block. Here we can add a paragraph. No one has rented this movie before. Or if you don't want to use the p tag, you can simply use text. This is not part of the standard HTML, but it's something that the Razor View Engine understands. So if no one has rented this movie, this if block will render our text without any markup around it. Okay, now we add an else block here and move this UL right here. So you can see working with Razor views is pretty easy. Now, let me show you a few more techniques. Let's say here in H2, you want to conditionally add a class, popular, if the movie has been rented by at least 5 customers. Otherwise, we don't want to have this class here. How do we do that? First, we use a code block. So @ sign code block. Here we can write any C# code. So I'm going to declare a variable, call it class name, and initialize it like this. If model.customers.count is greater than 5, it should be popular. Otherwise, it should be null. Now here, we can render class name. With this code, if class name is null, this class attribute will not be rendered in the final HTML. It will be added only if class name is popular. So let's try it. Run the application with Control F5. Okay, right-click the heading, inspect. Look, we don't have the class attribute because currently we have only 2 customers. Now let's go back to the view. I'm going to change this condition to greater than 0. Save. Now we don't have to recompile the application because this is just a view. So we can switch back to the browser, refresh. Now look at the heading. We have the class popular. So this is how you render classes dynamically. By the way, this technique is not limited to classes. You can use this technique to render any attributes dynamically. And one last tip. You can add comments in your Razor views using this syntax. @ star, star, @. And we can make it multiple lines. This is a comment on multiple lines. So earlier, when we created a view, I briefly explained what a partial view is. In this video, we're going to take a closer look at partial views. So in Solution Explorer, open up Views, Shared, Layout. This is the Bootstrap template that defines the overall look and feel of our website. So we've got the standard HTML head and body sections. Inside the body, we've got a div that represents our navigation bar. Let's collapse this, hold down Control, and press M twice. Below this nav bar, we have a container for our pages. Note this call to render body method. So what we put in our views will be placed here when the view is rendered. And you can see below that we've got a horizontal line and a footer. Now, I told you that a partial view is like a small view that we can reuse on different views. But partial views are not necessarily for reusing markup. Sometimes we can use them to break down a large view into smaller, more maintainable partial views. For example, let me expand this navigation bar element again. You can see that we have a fair amount of markup on this view. While this is not terribly bad, we can improve the maintainability of this layout by extracting the part that represents the navigation bar into a partial view. So let's do that. Back in Solution Explorer, right-click Shared, Add, View. By convention, we prefix partial view names with an underscore. So let's call this underscore nav bar. We need to tick this checkbox here. Create as a partial view. This way, this view will not have a layout. Okay, now Control Tab to get back to the layout. Scroll up a little bit. So here's our nav bar element again. Put the cursor on this element, hold down the Control, and press M twice. Okay, collapsed. Control X to cut. Back to navigation bar. Paste it here. Now we can see in this partial view, we only have the navigation bar, nothing else. So next time we want to change something on our navigation bar, we can simply jump to this partial view. We don't have to scroll up and down in the main layout. Save. Now back to the layout. So here's the content area of our pages. The navigation bar was above that. So here we need to render that partial view. We use @HTML. This is a property of our views, which is of type HTML helper. So it's a class that provides a number of useful methods to work with HTML. We're going to use the partial method. Here we pass the name of our partial view, underline navbar. That's it. That's how we use a partial view on another view. Now, optionally, we can pass a model to this partial view as the second argument of this partial method. Now, in this case, we don't have a model in our layout, but let me temporarily just declare a model for demonstration. So on top of this view, I'm going to add the model directive, and let's set this to random movie view model. Now here, if I don't specify a model, the model that is currently passed to this layout view will be automatically passed to this partial view. But let's say this navbar expects a movie, not the entire random movie view model. Then we can supply a model as a second argument. So model.movie. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground about various components of ASP.NET MVC. So in the next lecture, you will get a cheat sheet to quickly overview the materials in this section. And then I'm going to give you an exercise to put what you have learned in action. Okay, I want you to use what you have learned in this section and implement a few simple features in our Vidly app. So you can see here on the navigation bar, I have changed the application name to Vidly. And now we have only two links, customers and movies. In the customers page, we have a table with the list of customers, and currently we have only 2 customers. Now, these customers are not coming from a database. I've just hard-coded them in my action. For this exercise, don't worry about the database. In the next section, we're going to use the Entity Framework to generate a database for our application. Now, back here in the list of customers, if I click on John Smith, I go to a new page at this address, customers/details/1, which is the ID of that customer. If I change this to 2, you see Mary Williams. But if I change this to 3, we get a standard 404 error page because we don't have a customer with that ID. Now in the future, we can replace this boring standard page with a custom design, but for now, don't worry about it. What I want you to do as part of this exercise is to cater for various situations, like when we have a customer versus when we don't have a customer. Now let's go back. In the list of customers, if we don't have a customer, we should see a message like, we don't currently have any customers. So let me temporarily go back to my action and comment out the code that generates this list. And then refresh the page. Look, this is what I was talking about. So when implementing this view, cater for these scenarios. The list of movies is very similar. Currently we have 2 hard-coded movies, Shrek and WALL-E. And there's no link under these movies. If you want, you can add them, but it's going to be exactly like the exercise for customers. So go ahead and use what you have learned in this section to make these changes. And by the way, before you get started, look at the PDF I've attached to this lecture. There are additional materials in that PDF that you need to read in order to do this exercise. Now, if you want to see my solution, you can simply head over to github.com/mosh-hamedani. Here you see I have a repository created for this course, Vidly-MVC-5. Here we can get the latest source code or one of the previous versions of the application. You can see currently I have 8 commits. So let's take a look. So as I'm recording these lectures and modifying this application, I make small changes to the code and commit it to the repository. For example, you can see in the previous lecture, I extracted the navigation bar into a partial view. Let's take a look at this commit. I'm going to change the view mode to split because it's easier to see the before and after changes. So you can see in layout.cshtml, on the left side, this is what we had, and on the right side, this is what we currently have. So the red lines were removed and the green lines were added. You can see that I removed this div, which was our navigation bar, and replaced it with html.partial method. Let's scroll down. Here is another file, navbar.cshtml, which is a new file because previously we had nothing here, and now we've got all this markup for the navigation bar. So you can see I've got another commit here, solution, section 2 exercise, display the list of customers and movies. So throughout this course, as you do your exercises, you can always come back here and look at my solution. And by the way, when required, I always add comments to my solution so you know why I did something in a certain way. So be sure to read these comments. Alright, in this module, you learned the fundamentals of ASP.NET MVC. More specifically, you learned about action results, action parameters, convention-based routing, attribute routing, and razor views. In the next section, we're going to use Entity Framework and connect our application to a database. So I will see you in the next section. Well, if you made it this far, you seem to be very enthusiastic about learning ASP.NET MVC 5. And I highly recommend you to take my complete ASP.NET MVC 5 course on Udemy. This course contains 7.5 hours of content in terms of high quality video and audio, along with lots of exercises and real-world examples. If you're interested, you can get the course with a discount using the link in the video description. I hope to see you in the course.